You clicked because you're tired of paying a small fortune for prime rib, and I promise you're about to be glad you did. There's a cut of beef sitting in almost every grocery store in America, hidden in plain sight, that tastes richer, beefier, and more satisfying than the prime rib I used to spend $100 on every holiday. I know how that sounds. For 30 years, I didn't believe it either. Here's what I found out, and it changed the way my whole family eats. The best flavor on a cow does not come from the expensive middle. It comes from a spot the butcher quietly kept for himself, one rib over from where the ribeye ends. That knowledge used to be common in every kitchen in this country. It got buried when meat started coming shrink-wrapped with a brand name and a markup. Before this video is over, I'll show you the exact cut, the exact number of the rib it comes from, and a method written down in a home economics book from 1931 that turns a $12 roast into something that silences a dinner table. You don't need special tools. You don't need a fancy oven. You need a pan, an oven you already own, and about 10 minutes of actual work. Let me take you back to the moment this cracked open for me. It was 2 winters ago, the week before Christmas, standing at the meat counter in my little grocery store with the fluorescent light buzzing over my head. The prime rib was $17 a pound. I had a family of 8 coming. I did the math in my head and felt my stomach drop. And the old butcher behind the glass, a man named Ray who'd been cutting meat since the 1960s, leaned over and said something I'll never forget. He said, "You know, that's not even the best tasting piece, right?" I thought he was trying to sell me something cheaper to be nice. He wasn't. He was telling me a secret that used to be ordinary. "So let me ask you the question," Ray asked me. "What if the reason prime rib costs so much has almost nothing to do with how good it tastes? What if it's about which part of the animal became fashionable and which part got forgotten? To understand that, you have to understand how a cow is actually divided. Down the back of the animal runs a long muscle. Butchers call it the longissimus dorsi. That's the muscle everybody worships. When you slice it from the 6th rib back toward the hip, you get ribeye steaks and you get prime rib roast. Same muscle. That's the celebrity. That's the part with the magazine covers and the steakhouse prices. But that muscle does not magically begin at the 6th rib. It keeps going forward toward the shoulder, through the 5th rib, the 4th, the 3rd, and the section of meat sitting on the 5th rib, just one bone away from where the official ribeye ends, has a name most people have never heard. It's called the chuck eye. And here is the part that made me sit down when I first learned it. The chuck eye is the exact same tender muscle as the ribeye, plus an extra ribbon of the richest, most flavorful beef on the entire animal, a muscle called the spinalis dorsi, the part chefs quietly call the ribeye cap. The most prized bite in any steakhouse, the cap, the piece cooks fight over in the back, runs heavier through the chuck than it does through the fancy center cut. You are getting more of the best part for a fraction of the price, because it sits 2 inches too far forward on the animal to carry the magic word rib. I want you to feel the size of what that means. The last time I checked my store, boneless ribeye was $15 to $18 a pound. The chuck eye roast, same tender muscle, more of the cap, was under $6 a pound. For the same holiday roast, I went from spending well over $100 to spending around $40. Same table, same 8 people, more compliments than I'd ever gotten in my life. So why doesn't everybody know this? That's where the story turns. And it turns in a direction that made me a little angry once I understood it. For most of American history, people bought a side of beef, or a large primal cut, and broke it down themselves at home, or asked the butcher to do it in front of them. Families knew every part of the animal because they had to. The tender front shoulder cuts had names, and grandmothers knew exactly what to do with them. A woman in 1920 could tell you the difference between a blade roast and a chuck eye without blinking. Then the supermarket happened. After the Second World War, meat moved behind plastic. It got cut in a back room you couldn't see, labeled with simplified names designed to sell fast, and priced by a system that had nothing to do with flavor and everything to do with fashion. The center cut muscles got renamed into premium products. The shoulder cuts, which take one extra step of knowledge to cook right, got dumped into a bin marked stew meat or pot roast and sold cheap. Nobody sat in a room and plotted against you, but the result works exactly as if they had. The tastiest, most economical cut on the animal got hidden behind a boring label, and 2 generations of us walk past it every single week, reaching instead for the expensive piece with the famous name. I walked past it for 30 years. That's what still gets me. 30 Christmases. 30 years of overpaying for a cut that wasn't even the best one, while the better one sat 10 feet away for a third of the price, wearing a disguise. But knowing which cut to buy is only half of what Ray taught me, because there's a reason people gave up on the chuck in the first place, and if you don't understand that reason, you'll ruin it the first time you try. So let me tell you what almost everyone gets wrong. Here's the trap. The chuck comes from the shoulder, and the shoulder is a working part of the animal, so it carries more connective tissue than the lazy center back. That connective tissue is the whole game. Cook it fast and hot like a steak, treating it careless, and parts of it can turn chewy and disappointing, and you'll swear off it forever and go crawling back to the expensive counter. That single bad experience is exactly why the cut got its cheap reputation and never climbed back out. I know, because that's what happened to me the first time. I bought the roast. I was proud of myself. I threw it in a hot oven like I would a prime rib, and I pulled out something tougher than I wanted. I almost quit right there. I almost decided Ray was wrong and the expensive cut was expensive for a reason. Thank goodness I didn't quit, because the fix is old, it's simple, and it was written down long before anyone tried to sell you a gadget to do it. I found it in an old home economics book. Let me tell you about that book, because it's the kind of thing that got thrown out by the millions, and it's full of buried gold. Back in the early part of the 20th century, the United States Department of Agriculture and dozens of state agricultural colleges printed cooking and homemaking bulletins for ordinary families, and land-grant universities taught home economics as a serious science. These weren't opinion columns. They were tested, measured instructions on how to feed a family well on almost no money. In a home economics text from 1931, and in Department of Agriculture cooking bulletins from that same era, the instruction for the tougher, tastier shoulder cuts is stated plainly. Low heat, long time, moisture or fat to protect the meat while the connective tissue slowly melts. They understood something we forgot. That connective tissue, when you treat it gently, does not stay tough. It turns into gelatin. It bastes the meat from the inside. It makes the beef taste beefier, silkier, and more luxurious than the lean center cut ever could. The rich, mouth-coating quality people chase in an expensive prime rib, a properly cooked chuck delivers more of it because it has more of the stuff that creates it in the first place. The expensive cut is tender because it's lazy. The cheap cut is delicious because it worked for a living, and the old books knew how to unlock that decades before I was born. So let me give you the method, the one that turned my second attempt into the best roast my family had ever eaten. This is the part you can write down and use this week. You take your chuck eye roast, 3 to 4 pounds, and the day before you cook it, you salt it. Not a light sprinkle, a real honest coat of coarse salt all over the surface. Then you leave it uncovered on a rack in your refrigerator overnight, a full 12 to 24 hours. Do not skip this and do not cover it. This is the single most important step, and it costs you nothing but a night of patience. What's happening in there is the same principle those old bulletins understood without the fancy words. The salt pulls a little moisture to the surface, then that moisture, now full of salt, gets drawn back into the meat, seasoning it all the way through, not just on the outside. And the open air in the fridge dries the surface, so it will brown beautifully later. This is dry brining, and steakhouses charge you for it without ever telling you they did it. The next day you take the roast out and let it sit on the counter until it loses its refrigerator chill, maybe an hour. A cold roast cooks unevenly, tough on the outside before the middle catches up. Let it come toward room temperature. Patience again. Almost everything good about this method is patience. which is exactly why it got replaced by things that promise speed. Now here's the cooking, and this is where I broke every habit I'd learned from the fast, modern way of doing things. You do not blast it with high heat first. You set your oven low, 250 degrees, and you cook that roast slow, gently, until the inside reaches the temperature you want. For a beautiful, rosy, medium rare, you're pulling it around 125 degrees in the center, and a cheap meat thermometer, the kind that costs $10 or $12, is the only tool that matters here. Guessing is how people ruin roasts. A thermometer removes all the fear. If you've been finding value in uncovering these hidden food truths, I want to mention that I've gone much deeper into this kind of research in my book, Meat Smart. It's available through the link in the description, and it covers the full picture of which cuts your grandparents knew by heart and how to cook them the way the old bulletins intended. There's also the full system if you want the broader framework for eating well and spending far less across the board. These are the resources I wish I'd had when Ray first leaned over that counter and started changing the way I thought about food. But back to the story, because the result of that system works exactly as if they had. When it hits your number, you take it out, and now, only now, you crank your oven as hot as it will go, 500 degrees or more, and you put the roast back in for just a few minutes to blast the outside into a dark, crackling, deeply browned crust. Low and slow to cook it perfectly through, then a short, furious blast at the end for the crust. The old-timers did the reverse with a pan and a fire, but the principle is identical and it is 100 years old. Then you let it rest. 15, 20 minutes on the counter, loosely tented. If you cut it too soon, all that good juice runs out onto the board and you've wasted the best part. Rest it, and the juice redistributes back through the meat. Then you slice it against the grain thin, and you watch the faces around your table. The first time I did it right, my brother-in-law, a man who has never once in his life complimented my cooking, asked me where I'd bought the prime rib. I told him it wasn't prime rib. I told him it cost $40 for the whole thing. He didn't believe me until I showed him the wrapper. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, and I want to talk to you directly because I was you. Maybe you're thinking this sounds like it's for people with big kitchens and fancy equipment and a whole day to fuss. Maybe you live alone, or you've got a small oven, or arthritis in your hands makes wrestling a big roast sound like too much. I want you to hear me. This method is easier on you than the expensive way, not harder, and let me prove it with the simplest version there is. You don't even need the big roast to taste this. Walk into your store and ask for chuck-eye steaks. Same muscle, cut into individual steaks, usually 1 or 2 per animal so they sell out fast. But they are there, and they are cheap. You can cook one of those in a single cast iron pan on your stovetop, no oven required at all. Salt it the night before the same way, a good coat, uncovered in the fridge. Next day, dry the surface with a paper towel, get a heavy pan hot with a little oil, and lay the steak down. Here's the ordinary kitchen trick that changes everything, and it uses something already sitting in your refrigerator. Once the steak has a good brown crust on both sides, you drop a spoonful of butter into the pan, tilt the pan slightly, and spoon that foaming butter over the top of the meat again and again for a minute. That's it. That's the steakhouse secret. That butter carries heat and fat into every fiber, and it makes a $6 piece of shoulder taste like something you'd pay $30 for downtown. I do this on a weeknight in about 12 minutes. No project. No fuss. Just a pan you already own and a stick of butter you already have, and if lifting and turning is hard on your hands, this is actually the gentler path. A single steak in a light pan is easier to manage than an 18-pound prime rib you can barely carry. The cheaper cut isn't just kinder to your wallet, it's kinder to your body and your time. That's the part nobody tells you. So now you've got the cut, you've got the method, and you've got the weeknight shortcut. But I promised you something from the old books, a piece of buried knowledge that goes one step further, and this is the part that made me realize how much we truly lost. Because saving money on a roast is one thing. What the old butchers and old cookbooks knew about making cheap meat taste expensive goes deeper than the cut you choose. Here's the thing that stopped me cold when I read it. The reason a very expensive steakhouse steak tastes different from a fresh one at home isn't just the grade of the beef. It's time. Real steakhouses take their beef and they age it dry in cold open air for weeks. As it ages, natural enzymes inside the meat slowly break down the tough fibers, tenderizing it from within, and the flavor concentrates and deepens into something nutty and almost cheese-like. They call it dry aging, and restaurants charge enormous money for it because it takes weeks of space and careful conditions. And I always assumed that was impossible at home, something only a professional with a special locker could ever do. That's what the fancy world wants you to assume, but when I went digging through those old agricultural bulletins and butchery notes, I found something that had been quietly true the whole time. Aging beef is not a modern luxury invention. It is the original, old-fashioned, default way meat was handled before refrigeration got fast and commerce got impatient. For most of human history, beef was hung and aged as a matter of course. It's the fresh, wet, plastic-wrapped meat that's the modern shortcut, not the aged meat. And you can do a gentle version of it right in your own refrigerator with nothing but a plate, a rack, and time. Here's the method, and it costs you absolutely nothing. Take your chuck-eye roast, unwrapped, and set it on a rack over a plate, uncovered, on the bottom shelf of your refrigerator, the coldest part. Leave it there, undisturbed, for 3 to 5 days before you plan to cook it. The cold, dry air does the work. The surface will darken and dry, and that's supposed to happen. The enzymes inside are quietly tenderizing the meat and deepening the flavor the entire time, exactly the way they did in every ice house and cold cellar 100 years ago. When you're ready to cook, you trim off any hard-dried edges, and underneath you'll find meat that is noticeably more tender and dramatically more flavorful than it was 5 days earlier. Then you salt it, cook it low and slow, and blast it at the end, just like I told you. A few days of doing nothing but waiting turns an already excellent $40 roast into something that genuinely rivals a $200 steakhouse plate. The enzymes work for free. Time is the only ingredient, and time is the one thing those old cooks had that we traded away for convenience. I tried it, half expecting to throw away a ruined roast. Instead, I pulled out the best beef I have ever cooked in my life, and I did it in a regular refrigerator that came with my regular house, using a plate and a cooling rack I already owned. Nobody sold me a thing. That's the knowledge they let us forget. And it was written down plainly in bulletins printed for ordinary families who had far less money than we do today. Think about what that means for a second. The people who had the least were taught how to eat like kings, because knowing your food was considered a basic life skill. And somewhere along the way, that skill got taken out of our hands and sold back to us at a restaurant markup. The dry aging you'd pay a premium for is a thing your own refrigerator will do while you sleep. So let me put the whole picture together for you, because once you see it all at once, you can never unsee it. The muscle in a prime rib runs right on into the shoulder, and the piece sitting one rib forward, the chuck-eye, carries the same tenderness plus more of the ribeye cap, the single most delicious bite on the animal, for as little as a third of the price. It got hidden behind a dull label when meat moved behind plastic and the old knowledge left our kitchens. Salt it a day ahead so it seasons all the way through. Cook it low and slow so the connective tissue melts into silk instead of turning to rope. Blast it hot at the very end for a dark, crackling crust. And if you want to touch true steakhouse greatness, let it sit uncovered in your own cold refrigerator for a few days first, and let time do the work that restaurants charge a fortune for. None of that requires money. All of it requires knowing. And that knowledge was ordinary once, printed in government bulletins and taught to young homemakers as plainly as how to boil water, until it got quietly replaced by a system that profits every time you reach for the expensive cut instead of the smart one. I think about Ray the Butcher a lot. A man who spent his whole life behind that glass counter watching people line up to overpay for the famous cut while the better one sat right beside it, waiting. He knew. The old butchers all knew. They kept the chuck eye for their own families because they understood exactly what it was. He finally told me because I think he was tired of watching good people spend money they didn't need to spend on the belief that the expensive thing must be the better thing. It so often isn't. Here's what I want you to feel walking away from this. You didn't just learn a cheaper cut of meat. You took back a piece of knowledge that belonged to your grandparents and got quietly lifted out of your hands, and you're going to use it to feed the people you love better than the expensive way ever did. If you're the kind of person who's always suspected that the priciest option isn't automatically the best one, that plenty of good and honest methods got shoved aside simply because nobody could put a big markup on them, then you already understand what this channel is really about. We recover the things that worked, the things that cost less and tasted better before they got sold back to us with a fancy label. Now, I want to hear from you, and I mean this because I read these. Tell me in the comments, what did your family always call the cheap cut that turned out to be the best one? Was it your grandmother's Sunday roast, a stew cut nobody else wanted, a fish nobody would buy? Leave it below. I want to build a list of these forgotten cuts together. And tell me where in the world you're watching from, because these old kitchen secrets show up in every country under different names, and I love seeing how far they reach. If this opened your eyes even a little, subscribe and stand with the rest of us who are done being upsold. People quietly taking back the simple, honest skills that were working just fine before somebody decided we should pay more for less. Because next time, I'm going to show you the forgotten way our grandparents kept butter fresh on the counter for weeks without refrigeration and without it ever going bad. It sounds impossible. It isn't. It's written down, it works, and once you know it, you'll wonder how we ever forgot. I'll see you there. Before you go, one thing. This video showed the cut and the story behind it. But inside my membership, you get the full chuck eye method laid out plain so you can cook it this weekend. In there, you can ask me your own questions, and a real person, me, answers you myself. You won't be alone. Folks like you are already inside the old ways society. Just point your phone's camera at the code on screen. Cancel anytime with one click. Come join me.